This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The town of Cypress Grove, Texas, was as ordinary as small towns get, nestled in the heart of the Lone Star State. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where front porches were the gathering spots in the evening, and the scent of barbecues on warm summer nights filled the air. Its residents prided themselves on the town's slow-paced, family-oriented life. With a population just shy of 5,000, Cypress Grove was the epitome of an all-American, rural community, where church gatherings were as common as Friday night football games. The sun often shone brightly over the town, its golden rays casting long shadows over old brick buildings, country roads, and the few scattered farms that dotted the outskirts. Cypress Grove High, the largest public school in town, was a sprawling structure that sat proudly on the edge of the downtown area, a place where tradition ran deep. It was a high school of respectable size, its halls filled with the sound of lockers slamming shut, football team chants echoing after every game, and the hum of the everyday school rush. The students, most of them from long-established local families, were accustomed to the rhythms of life in the small town. They went to school, spent afternoons at the diner or hanging out by the local park, and knew each other's names as if they were all one big, dysfunctional extended family. From the outside, everything seemed perfectly normal, perhaps even idyllic. The town had a reputation for being quiet, even quaint, a place where violent crime was a rare, almost mythical occurrence, spoken about in hushed tones by the few who remembered the town's history. Yet beneath the surface, things were beginning to change. It wasn't apparent to the average resident, who went about their daily routines without giving much thought to the deeper currents at play in their community, but there was an undercurrent of tension building within the students of Cypress Grove High. It wasn't the usual rebellious teenage angst that most parents feared, no. This was something darker, something quieter. The school had seen its fair share of problem students bullying other students, the usual cliques of the popular kids, and a handful of troubled teens who kept to themselves. But the very structure of the school, the wide hallways that echoed with too many voices and the classrooms that felt suffocating in their monotony, had become a breeding ground for discontent and anger. Some of the most vulnerable were the girls, often overlooked, often dismissed, yet simmering with a rage that no one understood, not even themselves. Among them were Samantha, Zoe, and Madeline, three young women whose lives, on the outside, seemed to fit into the mold of the typical high school experience. But in reality, they were struggling, each in her own way, with emotions too complex and too dark to be shared with others. Samantha, the leader of the trio, had always been the smartest of the group. From the outside, she appeared calm and composed, a studious young woman who excelled in nearly every subject. She was quiet, introspective, and kept mostly to herself, but her intelligence and icy demeanor made her an enigma to both students and teachers alike. Samantha had grown tired of the small-town life, of the repetitive routines that seemed to trap everyone in their place. She looked at her peers, at their easy lives, their effortless social status, and felt the chasm between them and herself widen. They were ignorant and shallow, chasing fleeting dreams, while she saw through it all, understanding the futility of it. Her mind, capable of great things, had begun to twist under the pressure of her own thoughts, her frustrations, and her sense of isolation. She had never felt like she belonged. Zoe, on the other hand, had always been more volatile, a girl who wore her emotions on her sleeve. She was brash and reckless, lashing out at anyone who crossed her path. Where Samantha had withdrawn into herself, Zoe exploded outward, constantly getting into trouble. Her relationship with her family was strained. Her father had left when she was younger, and her mother, a chain smoker who barely kept it together, couldn't offer her the stability she so desperately needed. Zoe felt abandoned, misunderstood, and hopeless. She viewed the world as an adversary, a place that only punished her for being who she was. Her impulsive nature made her a dangerous person when her anger was provoked, but it also made her a willing participant in the violence that was to come. Then there was Madeline, the quiet one, whose pain was hidden so deeply that no one suspected her of harboring such darkness. Madeline blended into the background, her long hair always covering her face, her eyes distant and hollow. She was the kind of girl you might forget existed after a few moments of interaction. People saw her as shy, almost fragile, but behind her mask of silence was a mind that had been gnawed away by depression. Madeline had been abandoned by her father as well, and her mother's mental health had deteriorated over the years. The two of them lived in an old, dilapidated house at the edge of town, far enough away from the bustling heart of Cypress Grove to make Madeline feel like she was already living in a forgotten corner of the world. No one really knew her. No one had bothered to. And so, She continued to fade into the background, lost in her thoughts. Cypress Grove was a town that loved its secrets, its masks of normalcy, and its ability to push any troubling issues to the margins, as if to acknowledge them would spoil the illusion of perfection. The town had a certain pride about it, the kind of pride that came from decades of stability, the kind that assured its people that nothing bad could ever happen here. And for a long time, nothing did. But what the people of Cypress Grove didn't know was that the cracks in the foundation had been slowly widening, little by little, as the three girls at the heart of it all found each other. They were drawn together not by friendship, but by something much darker, a shared understanding of pain, of rejection, and a hatred that, once ignited, could not be extinguished. The town's peacefulness masked the simmering chaos that threatened to erupt. In the shadows of Cypress Grove High, beneath the red brick walls and beneath the surface of everyday life, the fuse had already been lit. The sun had barely risen over Cypress Grove High, casting long shadows on the concrete walkways as the students filtered into the school for another seemingly ordinary day. For most of them, it was just another Monday, a day to make it through until Friday, to laugh about the latest football game or plan the next weekend's party. But for Samantha, Zoe, and Madeline, the day carried a weight they could no longer bear, a sense of inevitability that pulled them closer to a precipice they could no longer ignore. Each of them had suffered silently for too long, their isolation growing with every passing day, every sneer, every taunt. For weeks they had felt the urge to do something drastic, something that would force the world to pay attention. They had tried to ignore it, to suppress the anger that festered within them, but it had become impossible to do so. The hate was no longer just an emotion, it had become a part of their identity, a fire that needed to be unleashed. That Monday morning, everything changed for Samantha. She had arrived at school earlier than usual, standing alone by the entrance, watching the other students shuffle by. She noticed the usual cliques, the easy friendships, the laughter and chatter that seemed so effortless for others. It was as if they had all figured out the rules of the world while she was left behind, out of place and out of time. Her eyes lingered on the popular kids, those who made everything seem so simple, beautiful faces, perfect clothes, smooth conversations, and a life of privilege that she would never know. They ignored her, as always, walking by without a glance, as if she were invisible. Samantha's fingers twitched in her pocket, her nails biting into the flesh of her palm. It had been building for months, the feeling that she was no longer a part of the world around her, the sense that she was fading away, becoming nothing more than a shadow. She had tried to push through it, to live the life she was supposed to live, to pretend that the cruel world of high school was just a phase, that things would get better, that someone would see her for who she was. But it wasn't happening. The isolation had become unbearable. Every day felt like a suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. The bullying from her peers had worsened recently. The boys who made jokes at her expense, the girls who mocked her clothes, and the teachers who never saw beyond her grades. No one noticed. No one cared. The resentment that had simmered within her was now a beast clawing at her insides, demanding release. It was during the morning assembly, as students filled the auditorium for the usual welcome back to school speeches, that everything truly shattered. Samantha sat with Zoe and Madeline, her mind racing, her thoughts spiraling. The assembly was long, tedious, and pointless. The principal droned on about school spirit, the football season, and the importance of academic excellence, but all Samantha could hear was the whispering around her. The snickers, the murmurs, the judgment. It was the same every day, her classmates pretending to care, pretending that they were all a part of something bigger, something important. But she felt like an outsider, a stranger in a world that had no place for her. As the principal announced the upcoming school talent show, Samantha's frustration boiled over. She had signed up for the talent show months earlier, determined to show everyone that she wasn't just a smart girl who kept to herself. She had prepared a speech, a powerful, impassioned piece on how the system failed students like her, how the town failed kids like her, and how, despite everything, she would still rise. It wasn't meant to be some dramatic, self-serving plea for attention. It was supposed to be a declaration of strength, a way to show the world that she was more than they thought she was. But that morning, just before it was her turn, something happened that made her blood run cold. A group of popular girls led by Rachel, a cheerleader who had always ridiculed her, started to whisper and laugh loudly, clearly at Samantha's expense. Samantha could see Rachel's eyes flicking in her direction, her lips curling into a smirk. She felt a surge of heat flood her face, a wave of humiliation that crushed her spirit. This was the moment that would push her over the edge. It wasn't just the taunts, it wasn't just the teasing. It was the fact that no one ever took her seriously. No one had ever taken her seriously. She had spent so much time trying to fit in, trying to prove herself, but every attempt only reinforced the idea that she didn't belong. She wasn't part of their world, and no matter how hard she tried, she never would be. The assembly continued, but Samantha was no longer listening. She felt a deep, gut-wrenching rage building inside her, a primal scream she could no longer hold in. Her heart was racing, her palms sweating. She stood up abruptly, leaving Zoe and Madeline behind. The world seemed to blur around her, the sound of her footsteps echoing in her ears. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know what had come over her. All she could think of was the cruelty of it all, how the world had failed her, how it had crushed her. She needed to make it stop. She needed to make them listen. It was then that the plan crystallized in her mind. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was instinct. The school knew the world had humiliated her for the last time. And this time she wouldn't let it slide. She wouldn't just be a spectator in her own life anymore. She would take control. She would make them all see her, and in doing so, they would never forget her. In the moments that followed, she met Zoe and Madeline in the hallway. Zoe's eyes were wild, her expression one of raw anticipation, as though she had been waiting for this moment as much as Samantha had. Madeline, as always, was quieter, her face a mask of unreadable emotion. But she didn't hesitate. She didn't question Samantha's sudden change in demeanor. She was just as ready, just as willing. They had all been silently preparing for this day. They had all felt the same anger, the same deep sense of injustice, and now they were going to act on it. Samantha pulled the duffel bag from her backpack, her fingers trembling as she unzipped it. Inside, the weapons were neatly arranged: guns, knives, explosives, all the tools they would need to make their mark. She had spent weeks researching, planning every detail. They would start in the cafeteria, where the students would be gathered for lunch, a place where the school's social hierarchy was on full display. They would strike fast with no hesitation, no mercy. It wasn't about the people themselves, not really. It was about the system, the world that had failed them, the world that had never cared. It was about making a statement, forcing everyone to look, forcing everyone to listen. The triggering event wasn't just one moment, it was the culmination of years of rejection, pain, and humiliation. It was the final straw, the thing that broke the camel's back. The moment when Samantha, Zoe, and Madeline realized that they would never be seen, never be heard, unless they made the world listen in the most brutal, violent way possible. And so, with the weight of everything that had ever hurt them pressing down on their shoulders, they walked into the school, ready to destroy everything. The time for silence had ended. Now they would make the world pay attention. The preparation for the massacre had started long before the day that would forever change Cypress Grove High. It began in the dark corners of their minds, in the silence of their bedrooms, in the lonely places where no one could see or hear. Samantha, Zoe, and Madeline had spent months, even years, silently planning, each of them in their own way, as their anger and frustration built to a point where the idea of violent retribution was no longer an abstract thought, but a clear, almost inevitable conclusion. They were driven by a shared sense of isolation, rejection, and a deep, gnawing resentment toward a society that they felt had cast them aside. Each girl had her own reasons for the path they were about to walk, but together they formed a bond of hatred and fury that was greater than any individual grievance. Samantha, the mastermind of the trio, had always been the most methodical and precise. She was the one who researched, who planned, who calculated. She was the one who had spent countless hours in the library, in online forums, and at the back of school, absorbing everything she could about weapons, security systems, and strategies for mass violence. She was quiet and meticulous in her approach, never revealing too much to anyone, keeping her thoughts locked inside. It was her idea to start small, to test the waters first. She had seen the cracks in the school's security, the complacency in the staff, and the way the students went about their days without fear. They were comfortable, too comfortable, and she wanted to disrupt that. She started by watching the scheduled school assemblies, lunch breaks, class changes, tracking everything. She knew the layout of the school like the back of her hand. She mapped out the hallways, the stairwells, the emergency exits, and the classrooms. She studied the routines of the teachers, the presence of security officers, and the blind spots in the system. She had even found ways to bypass the school's security cameras, making sure there would be no evidence of their actions until it was too late. Samantha's knowledge of the school's infrastructure was exhaustive, and she had a sense of pride in the way she could navigate the system unnoticed. But planning the attack wasn't just about logistics. It was about the tools they would need to execute their vision of chaos. Samantha had scoured online black markets and forums for months, using encrypted communication to purchase firearms, knives, and other weapons. She was careful, always using proxies and false identities, making sure that nothing could trace back to her. The weapons were simple, efficient, and deadly handguns, semi-automatic rifles, a few knives for close combat. Each item was chosen with precision, each one designed to make the attack as efficient and brutal as possible. It was not about making a statement with the weapons themselves, it was about ensuring that the devastation they caused would be swift, overwhelming, and complete. While Samantha had focused on the technicalities of the attack, Zoe's role in the preparation was more visceral. She had always been the more volatile member of the group, driven by her anger and desire for chaos. Zoe's preparation was about nurturing the rage, feeding it, and channeling it into something that could be unleashed without hesitation. She spent her free time in violent video games, becoming obsessed with the rush of adrenaline that came with simulated destruction. She watched countless videos of real-life shootings, trying to understand the psychology behind the killers, the tactics they used, and how they carried out their plans. Zoe was fascinated by the power, the control, the way an act of violence could turn the tables, make the world stop, make everyone pay attention. She wanted to feel that power, to hold the fate of others in her hands, and her obsession with violence became a form of escapism. Her most significant contribution to the preparation was the emotional conditioning. She had a way of drawing the others in, convincing them that this was the only path forward, that it was too late to turn back now. Zoe's words were persuasive, her energy contagious, and her ability to fuel the fire within the others was unmatched. She pushed Samantha and Madeline when they wavered, reminding them that they had nothing to lose, that the world had abandoned them long ago. She was the one who helped turn Samantha's meticulous plan into something personal, something primal. For Zoe, this wasn't just about retribution, it was about finally breaking free, about shedding the identity that had been forced on her and embracing the role of the destroyer. Madeline's contribution was the most difficult to see. She had never been as outspoken as Samantha or Zoe. Her depression and loneliness had made her a quiet observer, a watcher rather than a participant. But in many ways, her silence had been the most dangerous element of all. Madeline had always been the most fragile, the one who carried the most pain, the one whose emotions were buried so deep that no one had ever suspected her of harboring anything but emptiness. Yet, she was the one who had spent the most time thinking about the deeper implications of the violence they were about to commit. She had the most to lose, and yet she felt the most compelled to go through with it. Madeline's role in the preparation was one of emotional support, though it was laced with a quiet sort of desperation. She was the one who made sure that Zoe and Samantha stayed focused, that they didn't lose sight of the end goal. She kept the weapons hidden in her bedroom, where her mother, oblivious to the chaos brewing in the house, would never find them. She was the one who remained calm in moments of doubt, the one who told Samantha that this would give them the strength they had been seeking for years. Madeline had no illusions about what they were about to do. She knew the weight of their actions, but it didn't matter. The pain, the emptiness, had dulled everything else. All that remained was the sense of impending finality, the certainty that nothing would ever be the same after that day. The preparations weren't just about the weapons or the plans, they were about the emotional readiness. Samantha, Zoe, and Madeline had steeled themselves for the violence they were about to unleash. They had imagined the faces of their tormentors, their classmates, their teachers, all those who had made them feel insignificant and powerless. They had imagined the shock, the fear, the confusion that would grip the school as their plan unfolded. And with each passing day, their resolve grew stronger. The fear of what they were about to do didn't stop them. Instead, it fueled their determination. They had spent so long feeling helpless, and now for the first time they felt in control. They knew what they were doing, and they knew that nothing could stop them now. As the day of the attack drew closer, the atmosphere around them grew charged, electric with anticipation. They went about their daily routines, pretending nothing had changed, but beneath the surface, everything was different. Samantha had the weapons packed and hidden in a bag, ready for the moment when the time would come. Zoe had already planned their movements, their routes, the places where they would strike. Madeline had the final piece of the puzzle, the one thing that would ensure they had the support of each other until the very end. And then when the bell rang that Monday morning, signaling the start of another day at Cypress Grove High, they knew it was time. Time to make the world listen, to make the world feel the anger, the resentment, the pain that had been bottled up for so long. The plan had been set in motion. Nothing could stop them now. The first shot was the loudest. It cracked through the air, a deafening sound that echoed off the walls of the hallways and pierced through the murmur of students shuffling between classes. It was a sound that no one could mistake for anything other than violence. Within moments, the air became thick with confusion, fear, and the sudden realization that the unimaginable was unfolding before their eyes. Samantha's finger had been on the trigger, her hand steady, but her heart was pounding in her chest. Zoe, right beside her, was already moving, her eyes wide with the manic energy that had fueled her for weeks. Madeline, trailing a few steps behind, was silent, her face a mask of emotionless resolve. It started in the cafeteria, where the majority of the student body was gathered, eating lunch, laughing, talking, oblivious to the storm that had begun to roll in. The trio had spent weeks planning their moves, their targets, and the weapons they would use. The cafeteria, loud and bustling with the noise of teenagers talking over each other, was the perfect place to begin. They knew that the chaos would be instant, the confusion overwhelming. What they hadn't expected, though, was the sheer panic that would spread like wildfire as soon as the first shot rang out. Samantha had moved quickly, her feet carrying her with a kind of purpose she had never felt before. She was almost detached from the scene around her, her focus entirely on the task at hand. Her eyes were locked onto the back of the student body, her weapon raised and aimed at the most crowded part of the room. With her finger pressed hard against the trigger, she fired. The bullet tore through the air, striking a student in the chest. The force of the shot sent him stumbling backward, his body crumpling to the ground in a sickening thud. The room froze for just a moment. Then chaos erupted. Students screamed, some running for the exits, others diving under tables in a frantic attempt to shield themselves from the gunfire. The once vibrant cafeteria turned into a scene of panic and terror. Samantha's eyes darted around, watching as the bodies of the students around her scattered, some tripping over each other in a desperate attempt to escape, others just frozen in place, unable to comprehend what was happening. The panic was infectious, and it only intensified as Zoe joined in. Zoe, always the more aggressive one, had already pulled her handgun from the bag slung over her shoulder. She wasn't aiming as carefully as Samantha had. Instead, her gun was sweeping the room, firing shot after shot into the crowd with wild abandon. It was as if the gun was an extension of her body, each pull of the trigger a release of everything she had been holding in. She fired into a group of students huddling near the exit, the bullets finding their marks in the chaos. Blood spurted from the victims, their screams drowned out by the deafening gunshots. Madeline, trailing behind, was the most detached, the most eerie of the trio. Her eyes were vacant, but there was a strange calm in her movements. She wasn't caught up in the frenzy the way Zoe was, nor was she as clinical as Samantha. Madeline walked through the room like a shadow, her presence almost unnoticed amid the mayhem. She was careful, precise, methodical in her own way. She raised her rifle and aimed at a small group of students near the back, firing 2 quick shots that dropped them without hesitation. There was no joy, no elation on her face, only an eerie stillness as she moved through the chaos. Her movements were almost mechanical, as if she had already accepted that this was inevitable, that this was the only way it could end. The blood flowed freely now, staining the once white floors of the cafeteria red. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the acrid scent of sweat and fear. The air was thick with it, the panic, the chaos, the agony. Screams of terror filled the room, rising above the deafening crack of gunfire. Bodies lay in grotesque positions, some still twitching from the impact of the bullets, others already still, their eyes wide with fear. Students scrambled to flee, but the exits were blocked, the hallways too crowded. There was no place to hide. Outside the cafeteria, the school was in chaos as well. The sound of gunfire had spread to other parts of the building. Teachers tried to control the panic, shouting orders, but their voices were drowned out by the sound of gunshots and screams. A few brave souls tried to lock down the school, calling for emergency services, but it was too late. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too far gone. Samantha, Zoe, and Madeline moved through the school as if they were on a mission, as if they had been here before, as if they had rehearsed every step of this moment in their minds. They didn't rush. They didn't scream. They didn't waste time. Every action was deliberate, every shot fired with cold precision. They moved through hallways, classrooms, and the library, the carnage spreading as quickly as they did. They walked past the bodies of their classmates, ignoring the screams of those who begged for mercy. There was no mercy. There was no turning back. The violence had become a part of them, a part of what they had chosen to become. In the hallways, the fight for survival was a blur. Some students managed to barricade themselves inside classrooms, but it was no use. Samantha was there before they could even fully lock the door. With a single shot, she blew the lock off, sending the door crashing open. The students inside barely had time to scream before they were met with gunfire. Zoe's laughter echoed from the hallway, a shrill, manic sound that only heightened the terror of the moment. The school became a labyrinth of blood, chaos, and screams. Samantha's heart raced, but it wasn't fear that pushed her forward. It was the thrill, the adrenaline, the power that surged through her veins with every shot. Zoe was beside her, firing indiscriminately, her face twisted with something between excitement and mania. Madeline, always the quiet one, followed closely behind, never hurrying, never slowing down, her rifle never missing its mark. The trio moved like a storm, unstoppable, relentless, tearing through the school like they had no fear of the consequences, no fear of the world that would be left in their wake. By the time the police arrived, it was over. The school was a scene of unspeakable horror. The walls were covered in blood, the floors littered with the bodies of the fallen. The survivors, if they could even be called that, huddled in corners, trembling, some still in shock, others too numb to move. The trio had done what they set out to do. They had torn through the school with an efficiency that was both horrifying and staggering. It wasn't just the sheer number of lives taken, it was the speed, the cruelty, the unrelenting nature of the attack that would haunt everyone who heard of it for years to come. Samantha, Zoe, and Madeline were eventually cornered in the school library, their weapons empty, their rage spent. But even as the police closed in, they didn't look scared. They didn't look regretful. They had made their mark on the world, and nothing, not even the consequences, could take that away. The massacre was over, but the aftermath, the trauma, the scars it left behind, would never be forgotten. The aftermath of the massacre rippled through the small town of Cypress Grove like an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of the community. The horrors of that day, though only beginning to be understood, would haunt every person who witnessed them or heard of them for the rest of their lives. When the first sirens wailed and the police arrived on the scene, the school was already unrecognizable, a war zone of blood, destruction, and terror. The bodies were still fresh, their stillness only adding to the overwhelming shock. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sharp, acrid scent of gunpowder. The scent of death was everywhere. The initial response was frantic. Emergency services flooded the campus, their radios crackling with urgency, trying to make sense of the chaos. Officers and paramedics rushed through the hallways, stepping over the lifeless bodies of students, teachers, and staff, searching for survivors. It felt like an eternity before the first signs of hope students found alive. Some hiding in closets, others too injured to move, emerged from the chaos. But the sheer scale of the carnage was incomprehensible. Bodies were everywhere, in classrooms, hallways, and the cafeteria, all cut down in a matter of minutes, each of them left in a grotesque display of violence. The total count of the dead climbed quickly: 127 victims, each with their own life, their own story, now erased. As the survivors were carted away, some alive, others too gravely wounded to survive, the shock was palpable. Parents arrived at the school in droves, drawn by the news reports, their faces etched with panic and fear. They ran to the police barricades, desperate for information, searching for their children. There were no answers. Some found their children in the emergency rooms, others were told their loved ones had been taken away in body bags. The grief was overwhelming, an ocean of sorrow that had no shore. The town, once a peaceful suburban community, was now a place where every corner seemed tainted with the darkness of what had happened. The media descended on Cypress Grove with the ferocity of vultures. News vans lined the streets, their cameras and microphones poised to capture every horrifying detail. Journalists scrambled to interview witnesses, survivors, and family members, often pushing past police and emergency responders, their only concern the next sensational headline. The massacre became national news almost instantly. Every channel was filled with reports, some accurate, some speculative, as the facts about the attack slowly began to emerge. The story of 3 teenage girls carrying out the slaughter was so shocking, so unbelievable, that many refused to believe it at first. But as the details were revealed, how the girls had been preparing for months, how they had planned the attack with chilling precision, it became a dark reality that the entire country was forced to confront. Social media erupted in a frenzy of hashtags, outrage, and speculation. Videos and photos of the aftermath were shared endlessly, some taken by terrified students in the moments before the attack, others taken by emergency responders or news agencies in the days that followed. The images were haunting: students covered in blood, teachers lying motionless on the floors, the twisted remnants of what was once a school now reduced to rubble. People poured their hearts out online, expressing grief for the victims, anger at the perpetrators, and fear for the future. Comments ranged from expressions of shock and sorrow to outbursts of rage and calls for justice. The world, it seemed, had irrevocably changed. In Cypress Grove, the aftermath wasn't just about the dead. It was about the survivors who had to carry the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. Many of the students who had witnessed the massacre were left physically unharmed but emotionally shattered. They became prisoners of their own memories, unable to escape the visions of blood, screams, and death that haunted their dreams. They would never be able to walk through the halls of the school again without seeing the ghosts of that day. Counseling services flooded into the town, though there was no real way to undo the damage. No therapist could unsee the bloodstains. No group session could ever erase the sounds of children screaming for their lives. The emotional scars were deep and permanent. The community was divided. The families of the victims demanded justice, their grief turning to anger as they sought to understand how something so horrific could happen in their own backyard. They questioned the school system, the law enforcement, the parents of the perpetrators. How had 3 teenage girls been able to carry out such a massacre? How had no one seen the warning signs? How had the violence gone undetected until it was too late? The public outcry was fierce, and many called for the harshest punishment possible. The calls for justice were loud, but so were the debates. Some argued that the girls were victims themselves, products of an increasingly broken society that had failed them. Others said it didn't matter what they had done was unforgivable, and the world would never be the same. The investigation into the massacre was swift and intense. Police combed through the girls' homes, their social media accounts, and their school records. What they uncovered was a troubling and heartbreaking picture of isolation, alienation, and rage. The girls had been bullied for years, ostracized by their peers, dismissed by the adults in their lives. It was clear that they had been planning the attack for months, even years, but there were no obvious red flags. No one had taken their pain seriously until it was too late. The messages they had posted online were filled with anger and frustration, but no one had noticed. It was as if they had been invisible, unnoticed, until they became something the world could no longer ignore. As the days passed, the survivors were buried under a mountain of media attention. Their faces were plastered on television screens, their stories dissected and analyzed, their pain laid bare for the world to see. But even as the world looked on in horror, there was no real way to comprehend the depth of the tragedy. The massacre at Cypress Grove High was not just an isolated incident, it was a symbol of a world that had become numb to violence. A world where the signs of distress were ignored, and the pain of the vulnerable was overlooked until it was too late. The town of Cypress Grove would never be the same. The schools would eventually reopen, though the halls would be empty in a way they had never been before. The memorials, the vigils, the endless tributes to the victims would continue for years. But for the families who lost children that day, for the survivors who could never forget what they had witnessed, and for the community that had been torn apart by the violence, there was no real healing. There was only the slow, agonizing process of trying to rebuild, trying to make sense of something that could never be understood. The legacy of that day would linger long after the last candle had burned out, the last television special had aired, and the last journalist had left town. The massacre at Cypress Grove High School was not just an act of violence, it was a reminder that in the darkest corners of society, there are wounds that fester, that grow, and that one day might explode into something unspeakable. And though the names of the victims and the perpetrators would eventually fade from the headlines, the scars they left behind would never disappear. The investigation into the massacre was both swift and chilling. In the hours after the police had cornered the 3 girls inside the library, the scene was immediately secured, and the long, painful process of piecing together the events began. Forensic teams moved in, collecting evidence, while detectives interrogated witnesses, teachers, and anyone who might have had insight into the girls' lives. The bodies of the 127 victims were carefully removed from the school, and the town of Cypress Grove was plunged into a collective state of shock, desperately searching for answers. Early on, investigators discovered that the girls Samantha, Zoe, and Madeline had been planning the massacre for months. They had kept journals filled with notes on their hatred of the world around them, plans for the attack, and even dark fantasies about what they hoped to achieve. These journals, found hidden in Samantha's bedroom, painted a picture of 3 young girls, isolated and alienated, filled with anger that had festered over years of bullying, neglect, and emotional trauma. However, no one had truly seen the warning signs. None of their classmates, teachers, or even their families had suspected the severity of their rage. In the weeks following the massacre, the police delved deeper into the girls' digital lives, uncovering disturbing messages on social media. They had spent hours in online chat rooms filled with other disillusioned youths, bonding over shared resentment and fantasies of violence. Zoe had frequently posted violent images and rhetoric, while Madeline had quietly slipped under the radar, her social media presence minimal, yet still laced with dark, cryptic messages. Samantha's posts, by contrast, revealed a more calculated and disturbing mindset, one that had been preparing for this day for far longer than anyone could have imagined. Despite the overwhelming evidence of premeditation, the question of justice became tangled in a web of debates about mental health, society's responsibility, and the failure of those around them to intervene. Some argued that the girls were victims themselves, shaped by a broken system and an apathetic society. Others, especially the families of the victims, demanded the harshest penalties. Legal experts debated whether the girls should face charges as adults or if their age should mitigate their responsibility. Public outcry was fierce, and the case became a symbol of larger societal issues ranging from gun control to bullying, to the failure of mental health support systems in schools. As the trial progressed, the nation watched with bated breath. The girls' defense lawyers tried to paint a picture of them as victims of circumstance, their fragile psyches twisted by years of abuse and neglect. But the prosecution was relentless, focusing on the cold, methodical nature of the massacre. In the end, justice for the victims was a hollow victory. The girls were sentenced to life imprisonment, but the damage had been done, and no verdict could ever truly heal the wounds left in the wake of their unimaginable act. The investigation into the massacre and its aftermath would continue to echo through the town for years to come.